Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Adult Ed with Allison and Heidi for State College Presbyterian Church. If you don't know, I am the associate in college age and young adult ministry there. And this is my friend Heidi. I went to seminary with her, and she is currently serving a community in Northern Ireland. So, welcome back, Heidi. Thank you for being here again. We have been doing a series called Lessons We Learned from Our Mothers. Looking at the matriarchs of our Christian faith and in scripture. And today we are going to focus on Naomi. Now, she's not a traditional matriarch, but she's my favorite. So we're including her. So we're going to be looking in the book of Ruth and reading her story. Ruth is only 4 chapters long. So I beg you to read this story because it is my favorite. And then you can talk to me about it all the time, and it will be so wonderful. So please grab your Bibles and follow along with us as we look through the book of Ruth. Heidi, before we get into the text, will you tell us a little bit about the context of Ruth?
Yeah, so for those of you who are finding it in your Bibles right now, you'll find it right after the book of Judges. And so it's pretty early on in the Old Testament. And the book of Ruth actually takes place during the time of the Judges. And so that's part of the first line is in the days when the judges ruled, then this story happened. And the book is called Ruth, and Ruth is a main character. She is this Moabite woman who marries into this Israelite family, but then whose husband dies. And her mother-in-law is Naomi. And even though the book is named after Ruth, which is great, we love Ruth too, but Naomi is a very big character, and that's what we'll see as she both kind of opens the book and also closes the book of Ruth. And then a little bit more about how this book kind of fits into the story of Israel. At the end of the book, we will see that Ruth has a son named Obed, and Obed becomes the grandfather of King David. And in that way, Naomi and Ruth are both part of the genealogy of David and therefore part of the genealogy of Jesus. And so this is the story of this one family and God's working through them. Awesome. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's it. There's just so much to talk about in this book, and as Heidi knows, I could go on forever. So we actually have chosen to focus specifically on the theme of identity or belonging through the character of Naomi. This is going to give us a little more focus and just guide our questions. So keep that theme in mind as you are reading along with us or listening to us read. Those are kind of where our questions are landing. Some of the questions we're asking is, how does our identity change over time, and how does it stay the same? How is our identity impacted by our relationships with other people? And how is our identity impacted by our relationship with God? So keep those things in mind, and I'm going to jump in and read from Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So, Heidi, what should we be noticing here, especially looking at the theme of identity?
Yeah, so here a lot happens in these 5 verses. I mean, we're introduced to this whole family and kind of how they're all related to each other. And then 3 of them die. Naomi's husband dies and her 2 sons die. And so it's just Naomi left along with her 2 daughters-in-law. And so this opening kind of gives us who Naomi is introduced as, but even so, her identity kind of changes here because She is an Israelite, but then she's dislocated and goes to Moab along with her family because there was a famine in Bethlehem. She is a mother, but then her sons died. She was a wife, and then her husband dies. And so here we see kind of she's both introduced through these people, but then we see how through the changes in her life, her identity changes dramatically already. And then kind of in verse 5, she kind of emerges as the main character of the story for now. The woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And so that also kind of says something about her identity in terms of how she's viewed in this book. Like we see that she's a very prominent figure.
Yeah. It's interesting that they call her a woman when they took the time to name her. And they name everyone in this story, even the ones who are just like passing by. And we're going to focus on names a lot more as we move on. But I just wanted to highlight that names are so important here. The names, if we knew Hebrew, we would be in on some inside jokes here or some inside insights. For example, the sons' names, Malin and Chilion, they translate to things like sickness, infertility, consumptive, which is kind of this, alert for us to notice, oh, they're not going to be alive for long. They're named that they're temporary characters that are going to pass. And so just thinking about names too as we move forward, it will be an important way of how we understand identity. So with that, Heidi, will you read verses 6 through 18 for us?
I sure will. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. All right, Allison. So here we see kind of these 3 people working out what they're going to do and whether to go with Naomi or not. So what do we see happening here, especially in terms of identity and how those are maybe in flux right now?
I think one thing is we really see Naomi processing her identity change. She's like, all right, I'm in this foreign land. I'm by myself. I mean, I have these 2 daughters-in-laws, but I have to go back. And I think as she's processing her loss, she realizes that the loss of her sons also means the loss of her real connection with her daughters-in-law. And so she, I think, tells them, you have to go away. It's part of her mourning process to say goodbye to them and acknowledge that, she's no longer a mother. She mentions her womb and her future in that. And, she can't have kids, she can't provide for these daughters. And so she's processing that. And it's very different than the way Ruth sees her, right? She sees herself as like, all right, now I have to be separate from these daughters. They need to go home. They have different futures in store for them than what we originally planned. Um, but Ruth kind of pushes back and says, no, I still see you as my mother. And Naomi kind of just like is like, well, if she's going to stay, there's nothing I can do about it. Um, but I do think we see Naomi, really processing how her life is changing, and how she sees herself. Um, and that really is done through her relationship with Orpah and with Ruth.
Right. I think that processing is a good word. When I like have heard this story oftentimes before, I've kind of heard of it as Naomi is, trying to care for her daughters-in-law, and that's why she's telling them to go home. And that's kind of in some ways what she says here is, you'll be better off not with me, versus Ruth is trying to think of Naomi, and Ruth is saying, no, you'll be better off with me. But I also think that there is more going on than just each of them trying to look after each other. Just imagine Naomi after 10 years away from her home in Bethlehem. Here she is returning back, and she doesn't know, what life is going to be like there, and whether people will, welcome her in with, here she is returning back without her husband, without her sons, bringing along, foreign women. Like, that could have been a very scary thing, and it could have been easier for Naomi to just, go it alone.
Right. To come back with a daughter-in-law and without your biological son is kind of a constant reminder in that relationship that, like, you don't have a son anymore, but you have this daughter who in the context is just, she's not biologically related to her, she can't care for her in the same way. It just feels like they both like need different things from each other, as they understand who they are. Because Ruth, on the other hand, she's lost her husband as well, but she finds like comfort in the relationship of, maintaining her connection to Naomi and this family that she completely like joined into and embraced. So it's interesting to see them process things a little bit different. But I feel like Orpah's not around very long. What do we think about Orpah?
Sweet Orpah. So, I mean, something that always I find weird about this passage is they don't have this conversation like before starting out for Bethlehem. They're actually like all three going to Bethlehem. And then they kind of have this heart to heart where they decide, wait, should all three of us actually be going? And so I think Orpah, first of all, should get some credit that apparently she begun the journey with Naomi. And that presumably she would have been willing to go with her. But Naomi did give her the option, and Orpah decided to take the option that Naomi offered to her. And so I think that when we read the text, because Ruth's choice is focused on more, and the book is about Ruth, I think that we can tend to really elevate Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi. And then we can kind of say, oh, well, Orpah, she wasn't as faithful or whatever else. And we can kind of put a negative light on her. But it is important to say that the passage doesn't do that. The passage just says this is what she chose.
Yeah. And I think that it's so helpful to think about their identity in terms of like they're processing a grief. Because I do think like she makes a good choice. Her choice is to, care for herself and her future and, return to her family. That's probably going to be, I hope, a comfort to her. Yeah, and I think that's really important to say that the text does not shame her decision, and so we shouldn't either. And Naomi doesn't shame her decision. And if, we're focusing on Ruth being faithful to Naomi, actually Orpah is the one who is like faithful to Naomi's request. So I do think that that is an interesting thing that, yeah, people kind of write her off, um, because of Ruth just seems so ideological, especially for mothers-in-law that maybe don't always get along with their daughters-in-law.
Right, right. I mean, I think the text, this passage doesn't really, say that anyone's decision here was wrong. It just kind of says this is what happens, and this is what happened. And I think that, here we just see three women trying to negotiate what is going to be best for each other, what is going to be best for themselves, and that's a really complex decision that they're after. And you know, in this time where their identities are changing, as with so much loss and grief happening, here they are really trying to negotiate, like, what will their identity look like going forward, because part of identity involves who we're around and where we are.
Right. It will look very different depending on if she had stayed or left or where they are. Yeah. Shall we move along? Is there anything
Yeah,
we missed?
you read this next part, verses 19 through 22, because I know it's your favorite passage.
Here's my favorite. So join me. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought me calamity upon me?" Am I reading the last one too?
Yep.
So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
All right, Allison, why do you love this passage so much?
So I love so much about this passage. One, because of Naomi's name change here. The name Naomi has to do with joy, and she doesn't feel joy right now. And so she changes her name to Mara, which means bitter. And I just love it because I feel like she's embodying her emotions so well. Um, I think women, we often get like, oh, they're too emotional that we can't, we try to hide it. And she's just like, this is how I feel, and I'm acknowledging it. And not only am I acknowledging it, but you need to acknowledge it too. My experience and how I want my community to see me is something that I want them to address my grief and how I understand myself in this moment. And it's extremely vulnerable for her to share this with people, but also to acknowledge it in herself, especially in terms of how she understands God and her faith, through this bitterness that she's embodying. So I just feel like she gives me permission to um, just state what I feel, and she does it boldly. So that's one of the reasons why I love this passage so much, is Naomi claiming her identity as it's changed since these women have last seen her.
Right. So you were talking at the beginning of the book about how names are really important. And you said then about, the names of her sons and different things like that, and how um, they can really kind of say something about the person's identity. And here we see Naomi kind of taking that for herself and taking the initiative to change her own name, to change how she sees herself because of what she's gone through. And then, as you said, she not only says here kind of how she's thinking of herself, but also how she's thinking of God. And she says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. She says, the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. And so here she is, kind of attributing her sufferings to God, and also then calling God Almighty. It's this Hebrew word Shaddai, that is normally used during times of blessing, not not in times of suffering. But yeah, we really see Naomi still kind of working out her identity, working out based on what I've gone through, based on the suffering, based on 10 years outside of my home. What does this mean about who I am and who God is, and how are those things connected?
Right. I think that something that's so important to me in my faith is that I've like journeyed through my theological understanding is how much human experiences affects the way that we perceive God. And I think we see that so clearly here. Naomi Mara is taking everything she's been feeling and directs it toward her faith. Um, and I think that instead of keeping God at an arm's length when we go through times of grief or apathy or whatever, I think acknowledging that God is in how we experience God, God's character is in how we experience God, is really important here to how we understand our identity and how we understand God's identity and thus live out our faith.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that's exactly right. And yeah, just knowing that those things are connected and that the way that we see God and the way that we attribute things to God affects our relationship with God and how we see the world and ourselves.
Yeah. So we're going to move on. We've seen kind of Naomi at her lowest here. And we're going to jump ahead to the redemption in the story. And it feels a little bit like we're undermining her grief and her bitterness. Um, but I hope that you'll read the middle chapters. Basically, Ruth and Naomi meet a family redeemer, and he cares for them and supports them. They kind of care and support for themselves in making those connections with him. And spoiler alert, Ruth marries this person and they have a child, Obed. So we are going to jump ahead to the end of the book in Ruth chapter 4. So, Heidi, will you read chapter 4, 13 through 17 for us?
I sure will. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom, and she became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. All right, Allison, here we have the end of the book. What do we see happening in terms of how identity changes or stays consistent here with Naomi?
Yeah, I think one thing I notice is that Naomi's title of mother stays consistent. Um, she had biological children, so she is a mother in that way. She also is still seen as a mother figure to Orpah and Ruth, and continues to stay a mother figure to Ruth. We see that she calls her daughter in the middle chapters that we didn't read. And the title is again bestowed to her when she has this grandchild. And so the title has stayed the same. But it is interesting that though the title is the same, her identity in those changes very drastically. When she loses her children, she still maintains the title of their mother, but it's very different to be someone who's grieving the loss of sons, and then connected to someone who's not biologically your child, and then to have this grandchild who actually isn't biologically related to her, but is is seen to her as a blessing and bestowed upon her as, you know, a character of redemption that's including her back into the story. It's a hopeful future for her. So that's one thing I notice about her identity. What do you notice, Heidi?
Yeah, I think that that is a really important thing to talk about in terms of here she has this future lineage and is included in the lineage of David, but it's through this grandchild who is not biologically related to her, and so we see her how her redemption comes out about in a very different way than she had thought about. I mean, she had thought about having grandchildren through her sons, but then they had died, and it's just ironic that her redemption comes about through Ruth, this, foreign woman who, back in chapter 1, Naomi wanted Ruth to go back to her mother. Um, and just Naomi didn't expect that it's actually through Ruth that she would have grandchildren and that she would kind of have this hope restored to her that was taken away. Um, yeah, and so we just see how she does change and she carries grief throughout her life. And I think that circumstances do change identity to an extent. And yet there is kind of this core of who she is that does stay the same.
Right. I think another interesting thing is the role of the women in this passage, because they see her at a distance and call to her, is that Naomi? And so they see her one way and then they hear her story and I hope respond well. We don't really hear how they respond, but then here they acknowledge her again as having this connection, this hope, and helping her to establish herself with this child. um, so I just think that, like other comments we've made, of the way that our identity is shaped is also through the people around her. um, she was able to, I think, really see this child as a hope for her future because of the way that these women see her, but also how Ruth sees her. Like, Ruth clung to her and said, no, we are family. So even though they are not biologically related, they have this deep, deep kinship, um, that makes this possible for them for Naomi to hold this child as if it's her own.
Yeah, I think that that's good. Related to the women, another kind of interesting thing, back when Naomi again was speaking to the women and changed her name, she was talking about God, and she said how about how God had dealt bitterly with her, and kind of um, attributing that suffering to God. But here we have the women attributing this blessing to God again, and so it's kind of this nice reversal of saying, maybe those sufferings were from God, but here we have this blessing that's from God. And back in chapter 1, it was Naomi attributing it to God, but here it's the women who are kind of reminding Naomi, look what God has done for you now. I think that says that, sometimes it's helpful for us to name God's action in our lives, and sometimes we need other people to remind us to point out where they see God at work in our lives.
Yeah, that's really important to notice. I definitely know that's true for myself sometimes. So,
This last passage that you want to talk about?
I don't know. I think I'm good. I think just a huge part of her identity in the way that she fits into the context of scripture that you've already mentioned, even in the introduction context, is that she's in the lineage of Jesus, because Obed became the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. Like, I think that's a huge part of her identity that fits into the bigger story of how we understand Naomi. She's not just this like bitter widow. She's not someone to be neglected or thrown aside because she has this really significant role in the story. So I think that as readers looking at her, that's a big part of her identity too that we can point out.
Yeah, well, and just in terms of this adult ed series being called Lessons for Mothers. And as you say, we can really think of Naomi as a mother. And as you said, she's kind of kept that maternal role throughout this book. And she is kind of a mother of sorts to David and of Jesus. And so thanks to our mother, Naomi.
Yes, thank you. So speaking of that theme, we've been asking questions at the end of all of our studies. What lessons do we learn from Naomi? What might we learn about God from this text? And what might we learn about ourselves from this text? And so let's jump in. Let's start with, what lesson or lessons do we learn from Naomi?
Yeah, so kind of going back to her speech in chapter 1, it just stands out to me that when she's gone through so much and when she's really in pain and undergoing suffering, she tells it like it is. She is negative. She says, "Call me Mara, for I am bitter." She says that, God has dealt bitterly with her. And I think that those are phrases, or that type of language is maybe what people today are a little bit afraid of doing. Even just in talking to people about this pandemic that's going on, and how it affects all of our lives. A lot of people tell me, "Oh, I don't want to complain about it," or, "Oh, other people have it so much worse." And I think it's a balance, right? Of like, maybe we don't need to be a negative Nancy all the time, but it's okay to say, "Wow, this is awful." Like, this should not be happening. This is really bad. Call me Mara, for I am bitter. I think that I think it's just so good to be honest about difficult things. And it shows that we have a big enough belief in God, that we believe God is big enough to take our anger and our frustration.
Yeah, I think that fits in with the lesson I was thinking of. I just feel like this lesson is giving me permission to feel those things, to acknowledge when I'm feeling bitter or sad, and know that is authentic to my experience, and I can voice those things aloud, to my friends, in my journal, however, to God, and I think that permission is really important for me sometimes. um, yeah, and just acknowledging that things change, I guess, and so naming the times when I feel like Naomi and naming the times when I feel like Mara, um, are all appropriate.
I love that. So then our second question is, what might we learn about God through this text?
I think something, I don't know if it's necessarily about God, but is a question I have. It's just, I wonder how our perceptions of who God is affects our faith. Naomi, as Mara, sees God in a certain way and understands God to be acting in a certain way. And I guess what I learned about God that then is, even though we might have certain perceptions of how God is acting, or how God is treating us, there is more going on. We see a little slice of the pie, but God was working to redeem Naomi, as well, as the women point out to her in the end. And so I guess that I need to be careful not to keep God in a box, or I guess not to make it about me, but about God. Is God doesn't fit in my box, and that is a beautiful, beautiful thing about God's character.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. What I'm thinking about, what I'm learning about God from this text, is something that we talked about a little bit before, I think, when we talked about Rebecca, which is that God is always at work in these narratives, even when not always explicitly named. I think that as we read Old Testament stories, there can be a lot of stories, and sometimes we can think, okay, like, where is God in all of this? And in Ruth, we see things attributed to God sometimes, back in the beginning, back in chapter 1, and then here in chapter 4, we see people saying, oh, God did that, basically. But we don't always see in the details of what is God doing and how. We just see ordinary people living their lives, and we see these women, making decisions about whether to go to Bethlehem or not. And we don't always see, God speaking to them in the moment or anything else, but we see that God is at work in this family. We see God at work in the story. And I think that can be a helpful reminder to me in my life and in our world today, that even when it's not always clear how God is working, God works through the ordinariness of our lives.
I think too, like ordinary and also unlikely. That's another thing. I often forget like how extraordinary it is that there's this book in our Bible that's so focused on women. This widow who had moved to a foreign land and this foreigner become a part of Jesus's story. And those are the people God chooses to use in their ordinary lives. So I think too, ordinary and unlikely sometimes are the places where we need to be looking for God more.
That's good.
So let's jump to our last question. What might we learn about ourselves from this text?
Yeah, and so I'm still really just intrigued by this kind of idea and question of identity. And, you and I have kind of been wrestling with like, what is identity and how does it stay the same? How does it change? How is it dependent on, how is my identity dependent on myself, and how is it dependent on others? And how is my relationship with God involved? And I just still think that those are questions I want to take with me and wrestle with. But I do think we see here that my identity is partly how I see myself, and it's partly me in community. It's how I interact with others. It's how people see me. And we see Naomi's identity change depending on who she's with and the circumstances of her life. And yet there is something about her that remains consistent in all of that. And so I think that that's a helpful thing to remember, that my identity isn't just me, it's also other people. And what does that mean for me in the ways that I act in community, in the ways that I value other people and value other people's identities in community? Because we can only be ourselves in community.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway. I think for me, something I need to acknowledge more is just how important it is to name how God is working in my life, whether it's something I see as a positive or a negative from my perception, but naming it regardless, just because it does affect how I relate to God and how I relate to others and how I relate to my faith. Putting God at the forefront of how things are going, whether it's seen as blessing or curse, I think is just a really good practice. And it is a good practice because it will help me to process, especially like during this time where my life looks very different than normally because of pandemic. Processing where God is in there, I think helps me to like understand the experience in a fuller, deeper way. So I think that that's one of my takeaways about something I learned about myself is I need to be better at naming God in my own life.
I think that's really good. And being able to recognize and name God in other people's lives as well. As we see the women doing in the last chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think those are my final thoughts.
Those are my final thoughts.
Good. We're on the same page. We work so well together. Again, thank you to everyone who tuned in, whether you are here just for Naomi or if you've seen our other collaborations. We hope that you will, take this text and you learn something, or found some peace just in hearing us talk. However, we ask that as you go forward from here, that you think about these questions for yourself. So I'm going to repeat them. Um, what lesson or lessons have you learned from Naomi today or other times, or maybe as you continue reading? Um, what did this text teach you about God? And what did this text reveal about yourself? So I hope you take those questions, talk about them with your family, think about them as you go for a walk or clean your house or whatever you plan to do today. Um, Peace be with you as you live your day, and have a great one. Bye, everyone. Bye, Heidi.
Bye.